Hello everyone, my name's Chrissie Boughey and I'm going to be talking to this PowerPoint on giving feedback on students' writing. The poor quality of students' writing is one of the things that supervisors most often complain about. Supervisors say they can't understand the writing's in a mess, the writing's full of mistakes and errors, and so on. Supervisors also spend enormous amounts of time giving feedback to students on their writing. Literally hours and hours and hours of really hard work giving feedback. If supervisors spend so much time giving feedback to students on their writing, the question then is how you can use that time most efficiently. How can you make sure that the feedback you give is truly useful and which benefits students in developing their writing? Some of the earlier work on this course has focused on writing and has argued about what good writing is, about how it's joining a disciplinary community, and so on. What's important to remember is that good writing isn't necessarily just correct writing which doesn't have any grammar errors, any spelling errors, and which is well formatted, and so on. Good writing makes meanings which are appropriate to the context. So for supervisors, the question has to be, how do you give feedback which helps students make meanings which are appropriate to the context of the PhD in its disciplinary area? So how do you do that? In order to understand how we can give feedback which is really constructive and which develops students' ability to write about their ideas in a way which is appropriate to the PhD, we need to go back to some basics. More specifically, we need to go back to the basics of understanding how we use language to make meaning, first of all through speech. Many of us have had the experience of having students who can speak about their work relatively well. They come to see us for a face-to-face supervision and they just tell us about their thinking, or they present an argument to us and we listen and we think, yep, okay, they're doing well. The student goes away and then the next thing is we receive a piece of writing. And when we read that writing, those impressions from the face-to-face supervision fall away because the writing nowhere near matches what seemed to us the student was saying in speech. Why is this? Why is it that students can argue, can explain, and so on in speech, but that when they try to do those things in writing, the whole process often falls apart? All of us learn to use language in speech from very early childhood onwards, through the normal course of social life, through interacting even as very small babies with those who are looking after us, with mothers, fathers, other caregivers, with our brothers and sisters. Many people across the world never go beyond this. They can communicate perfectly well in speech, but they never learn to read and write. It's just not necessary in their daily lives. So speech is primary. And through learning to speak, we learn how to make meanings successfully. Think of what happens in a two-way conversation, in a conversation with another person, whether you're both face-to-face or on the telephone or whatever. If the person you're speaking to isn't making sense, you interrupt them. You tell them they're not making sense. You say things like, hang on, I don't understand what you're saying here. Can you explain? Tell me more. You interrupt them. If the person you're speaking to says something that you disagree with, again, you interrupt. You tell them so. You tell them that you disagree, and you tell them why you disagree. So you'll say something like, yes, but what about so-and-so? You've also got to consider this, that, or the other. You interrupt their flow as they speak and indicate your disagreement. In a similar fashion, if someone says something that is incomplete and that could be expanded upon, we, as people in the conversation, again interrupt and we provide some additional explanation. We'll say something like, yes, and of course, and we add the extra information. So we elaborate on what the person is saying. Generally speaking, if there isn't any problem or comment to be made, we allow the speaker to carry on. We allow the speaker to say what is making sense to us. So as young children, learning to communicate through early interaction with our caregivers and our siblings, we learn these strategies. We learn to interrupt when what is being said to us doesn't make any sense to us, when we want clarification, when we want to object, and so on. We learn how to do that. And as speakers, we learn how to adapt to what those who are objecting, who are asking for clarification and so on, are requesting of us. We'll rethink, we'll rephrase, we'll add extra information, we'll make a stronger argument. So we learn how to do that through the very acts of learning to speak. Now think about the differences between writing and speech. If you go back to that face-to-face conversation, the people in the conversation make meanings jointly. They help each other to make the meanings that they feel are appropriate because of the sort of things that I was talking about involving interruptions. If you think of writing, on the other hand, that's a solitary process. It's a lonely process. It's us and the piece of paper or the empty screen. As individuals, we have to make meanings alone. Research on writing, and there's a great deal of research, which looks at writers as they write, tells us that successful writers, those who make meanings which are appropriate to the context, which satisfy their readers, employ strategies characteristic of speech in their writing. They do this by having what the literature calls an imaginary conversation with their readers. So what is this imaginary conversation reported in the literature? Well, the writer writes, and because the writer is always anticipating what the reader might say to what is being written, the conversation goes, if I say this, she'll say that. So I can't say it. I'll change it. Delete, delete, delete. And then the writer redrafts. So what happens in the imaginary conversation is that the writer imagines what the reader might say in response to what they're writing. And through that process of imagining what the reader might say, the writer adjusts the meaning making of the writing. And as a result of this imaginary conversation, the writing becomes a process of drafting and redrafting in response to these imagined comments, this voice in the writer's head of what the reader might say in response to what has been written. The problem with a lot of writing instruction at school and instruction at university in courses intended to teach students academic writing is that no one ever talks about the strategies for making meaning. The focus in writing instruction is usually on the forms of the language. So, for example, at school, children are taught a sentence begins with a capital letter and ends with a full stop. In university writing courses, students are taught an assignment must have an argument. It's got an introduction, a body, whatever that is, and a conclusion. The focus is on what the finished writing should look like It's not on what you need to do as a writer to get something, to produce something which satisfies the reader, which makes them happy with the meanings that you're making. So although nobody tells any students about the strategies they need to employ to make meaning in writing, nobody tells them about what they do in speech and points out that they need to carry this over into writing, something does carry over. What carries over is the rule, if you like, from conversation, that if the meaning making is satisfactory, if it's okay, there's no interruption, so you carry on speaking. So the student begins to write, nobody interrupts, so they carry on writing, even though what they're saying doesn't make sense or isn't adequate in some way. So what does this mean for you as a supervisor who wants your student to be able to produce a thesis which is acceptable to the examiners, which might even get read by some other people, who will eventually be able to publish in the literature? What does it mean for you? What does it mean for you who wants to spend the time that they spend giving feedback most efficiently to make sure it will actually make a difference? Well, it means you have to teach students about the imaginary conversation using your feedback. It means that you have to appear, your voice has to appear in the margins of their text, interrupting them over and over again. So how do you interrupt your students in writing? How do you insert your voice in writing? Well, you can do this electronically using the word comment feature under review. What you might say to them in a conversation, you write in the comment box. If you've got a hard copy of students' work, you write in the margins. But what you're doing is interrupting them and telling them about your needs as their reader, where they're not making sense, where they could expand upon what they're saying, where you disagree with what they're saying because there's another perspective to be considered. You interrupt the flow of their writing just as you would interrupt the flow of their speech if you were in a face-to-face conversation. So what do you write in the margins of students' text? What do you write in order to engage in this conversation in writing with them? Well, it's a good idea always to focus on writing questions. Writing questions which prompt students to rethink what they've written, to help them to redraft what you've experienced as problematic. It's best not to instruct them. Don't tell them what to do, what needs to be done. Try to ask a very direct question which indicates the problem that you're having with their writing. Pose a question which will allow them to see that they're not making sense, or they're not making sense in a way which is adequate for what they need to do. So, for example, if the text simply doesn't make sense, open a comment box if you're using Word and say, "I'm not sure what you're saying here. Can you clarify?" Alternatively, you could say, "I'm really not sure what you're trying to say. Do you mean this or do you mean that?" Leave it as a question. The student needs to redraft in a way which will make the question go away, which will make the question disappear. If you disagree with what your student is saying, tell them so in the form of a question. You could say, for example, "Okay, but what about this?" and explain your objection. Alternatively, you could say something like, "How do you account for what so-and-so says?" where you draw on an opposing viewpoint that exists in the literature. Again, through asking a question, the responsibility goes to the student to answer the question through the redrafting of their text. If what the student has said isn't adequate, if it could be expanded upon in some way, you could say, yes, of course, and there's also so-and-so. Can you tell me a bit more about that? Can you explain this a bit more? Again, try as far as possible to insert your comment in the form of the question, so the responsibility passes to the student in order to respond. The point then is always to try to interrupt what the student is saying in writing with a question which points directly to the problem that you are experiencing and which will help the student to see what's wrong and to see what they need to do in order to make their text more meaningful, more adequate for the task at hand. Most importantly, though, remember that your role of a supervisor is much more important than that of an editor. Your job is not to correct grammar. Your expertise lies in a completely different area to this. Your expertise lies in helping your students develop an argument, develop meanings which are appropriate to your disciplinary context, which are appropriate to the PhD. Remember too that correct grammar, spelling and punctuation doesn't mean that the writing is necessarily good. You can have something which is faultless in relation to the grammar, the spelling and the punctuation, but it still isn't a good piece of academic writing. If you focus on correcting grammar, you won't help students to make the appropriate meanings. They need to build strong meanings. They need to build the argument. They need to write in a way which is appropriate to the PhD before the grammar and the spelling and the punctuation and so on is corrected. So remember where your expertise lies. Remember what your role is as a supervisor with this developing high levels of thinking in your students. When you write the assignment, which serves as the assessment for this course, we'll give you one round of feedback. So we'll comment on your writing in the way that we've argued that you need to comment on your students' writing in this PowerPoint. So you'll actually have the experience of us trying to engage you in this conversation in writing. So we hope that that process will also help you to develop the ways you can give your students really effective and constructive feedback and develop them as writers at PhD level.